So our next speaker, Steve Finlay, I just want to correct this. This is your first public speaking appearance?
No, I've spoken many times before, but I cannot ever speak as an official LEAP speaker.
Okay, well, you're the Secretary-Treasurer on the Board of Directors, right? So Steve Finlay is one of the very few members of, high-profile members of LEAP who's actually not an ex-law enforcement member. But Steve has really worked incredibly hard with LEAP. I would hope everyone in this room knows what LEAP stands for and who they are. They're an incredible group. And Steve has really been working behind the scenes for many, many years. And I'm very happy to have him making this presentation today because he's one of the smartest guys in this movement, one of the hardest working guys in this movement. And I really don't like it when he tells me I'm wrong online because I know he's going to be right. But really, it's something that we would be much worse off without intellectuals like Steve working behind the scenes. And he's done a great deal of work with his presentation today on the economics of drug prohibition, and I'm very proud to have Steve Finlay here to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ted. I'm very honored to be invited to speak here, and as Ted said, or as I said, I always have to be careful about this, I'm not an official LEAP speaker, because to be an official LEAP speaker you must be a current or former law enforcement person. However, it is a huge honor to me to be a civilian supporter of the men and women in LEAP. Most of you know LEAP is Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and these are law enforcers and judges, prosecutors, police officers, prison people, all the kind of people who have learned by trying to enforce prohibition that it's a bad idea. And I support them because if you are talking to people who aren't in the cannabis community and whose ideas of cannabis and marijuana and drugs in general come from the what I would call propaganda that has been produced over the last 40 years. Someone like you or like me can say anything we want, and we can be as correct as possible, and we can have 100% perfect, unshakable evidence, and it will all go in one ear and out the other. But when somebody like Bill Vandergraaf, who was a staff sergeant with the Winnipeg Police and worked in the Winnipeg Police for 32 years, when he says those two guys were sitting there outside in their cruiser outside the hotel waiting to catch some young people for pot, and they weren't available when I needed them to go out to deal with an assault. When he says that, people have to listen. They have to listen because he was there, it really happened, and they can't pretend Bill doesn't know what he's talking about. So I joined in support of LEAP because I knew that people would listen to them who would not listen to me. That's why I'm in LEAP. But today I'm not talking about LEAP at all. So I hooked Ted in. He knows I'm in LEAP. He invited me to speak, but I hoodwinked him because I'm not going to talk about LEAP. And the other way in which I don't fit in here is I'm not going to talk about cannabis. This is a cannabis convention. No, I'm going to talk about prohibition, and I'm going to talk about it from the viewpoint of economics because that is my training. I'm not a law enforcer, I can't talk from that perspective, but I sure can talk from the economics perspective. I specialized in policy economics in my MBA. As it says there, I was the Dean's Medal winner that year. So when it comes to economics, I'm confident I know what I'm talking about. All of you who have studied economics, the first part of this presentation, you'll recognize everything. Those of you who haven't studied economics, pay attention, because this first 2 or 3 slides might mean you don't need to take 2 or 3 economics courses. For the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about first, as I said, the principles of economics. Then I'm going to define prohibition, and this is important because in the public discussion, there is very often a confusion about what prohibition is. Then I'm going to go to the bulk of the presentation, which is once you know those predictions, those principles of economics, when you look at prohibition, you know what is going to happen. Everything that you've experienced dealing with cannabis prohibition and all the negative effects that you have suffered, any economist could tell the government that that's guaranteed to happen. And I'll show you what. So let's go into principles of economics. A lot of people get mad at economists. People get mad at economists because they think economists are saying people are greedy. They think economists are saying greed is good. Well, Gordon Gekko said that. He wasn't an economist. And people get mad because they think greedy is bad. And they don't like economists talking about greed. Well, economists, what economists are talking about is not whether it's good or bad. Probably most economists, if you push them hard enough, would probably agree that greed is not really a great thing. The point of economics is whether greed is good or bad, it exists, and enough people are greedy enough of the time that we can use that information to forecast what happens under certain policies. That's what economics is about. So you don't get mad at the economist for saying people are greedy. The economist is merely trying to understand what that leads to. Next thing. People will voluntarily, nobody has to force them, make a deal with each other. Oh, sorry, back to the previous slide, I didn't mean this. People will voluntarily make a deal with each other if, and only if, somebody is better off and nobody's worse off. This is called Pareto optimality. All of you who study economics know that already. And this is pretty significant because anybody ever heard of Neanderthal man? Do you know what has recently been discovered about Neanderthal man? It used to be thought that Neanderthal, compared to Cro-Magnons, which is us, it used to be thought that Neanderthals were stronger and larger than Cro-Magnons, but dumber. It's pretty much understood now that that's not true. Neanderthal man had a larger brain than we have. Neanderthal man was also stronger, physically more robust, probably more able to survive bad climate. Neanderthal man had the advantage over us in brains as well as brawn, yet is extinct. Why? Well, nobody really knows, but one interesting thing is that some archaeologists looking at what is found in Neanderthal sites and Cro-Magnon sites, you can find evidence of trading in Cro-Magnon sites. There is zero evidence of trading in Neanderthal sites. It is possible that this ability, this tendency of human beings, is what made us survive and what made Neanderthal extinct. It is possible, we don't know. My point is that this trading ability that human beings have is actually very fundamentally important. If we did not trade with each other, not much of what we have, we would have. The next one on the slide, prices. If you've got a stable currency, and if the trading is all voluntary, prices basically mean two things. How much do some people want something, and how hard is it to produce it? Compromise between those things creates a price. Then this one. Remember I said economists are not arguing whether greed is good or bad, they're just saying we know enough people enough of the time are greedy, and therefore we do know that if there is an opportunity to take a profit, some people will take that opportunity, and if the profit offered is bigger, more people will be more interested in whatever that opportunity is. Okay, next slide. However, it's not just the amount of profit, it's also the risk. If the profit is more risky, that's not quite as attractive. So if some business offers profits, but they are risky profits, well, in order to attract people into it, those profits are going to have to be higher. Next point. There is a concept called an economic profit. Any business needs to earn, basic level of profit for people to get into it. If there's zero profit, people will leave. But In some businesses, people earn profits that are above what would be enough to keep them in the business. Those extra profits are called rents by economists. You generally, in order to get economic profits, in order for those to exist, there pretty much needs to be something that stops new suppliers from getting into it. If new suppliers can get into the business, then they probably will, and there'll be price competition, and those economic profits will disappear. If the economic profits are going to stay around, are going to last, you pretty well need some kind of a barrier to entry to keep some of the competition out. And the bottom thing, I have worked in large companies, 5 years for Procter & Gamble, then 20 years for TELUS, where I still work now. And what you get marketers in these large companies doing pretty well 100% of their day is trying to figure out some way to earn economic profits. Most of business management, business strategy is aimed at that. Trying to find some way that we can earn not just 10 or 15%, but 30% profit on whatever we're selling. It's a very strong motivator. Before we go on, any questions about these basic economic concepts? I've sort of given you most of a first-year economics course. Okay, next slide. Now, I said I'd define prohibition. Prohibition has a specific meaning. Prohibition does not just mean thou shalt not kill. Prohibition, economically speaking, means outlawing a transaction that both people want to participate in. This is a fundamental difference. Thou shalt not kill is not a prohibition on a transaction that both people want to be in. The person being murdered doesn't want to be in that transaction. Prohibition, economically speaking, and in terms of policy, is limited to those situations where somebody tries to say, this thing that you two both want to do is illegal. So it applies to drugs, applies to gambling, applies to prostitution, does not apply to murder, does not apply to burglary, does not apply to rape. In Latin, there's a difference between these two types of things. The crimes such as murder, theft, rape, and so on are malum per se, evil in itself. The so-called crimes such as prohibition of drugs are malum prohibitum, evil because somebody said it was prohibited. So this is the definition. It's important to understand that because you'll get people saying, well, you're trying to say legalize drugs, well then we should legalize murder too. Well, they missed this rather important difference. That's why I go on about that difference, is because you will get opponents making this false equation between malum prohibitum and malum per se. Okay, next slide please. Now I'm going to talk in the rest of this, the main part of this, about why prohibition is bad from an economic point of view, but this is just to tell you how long have economists known prohibition is bad. I found that in Adam Smith's great work, written in 1776. Read what he said. He's not talking about drugs, but he's talking about prohibition. And of course, writing in the 18th century, he says it in a rather elaborate way with quite a few big words. But notice that he says the same thing that all elite members say, and everybody here knows. He's basically saying, 1, prohibition doesn't work. 2, prohibition makes it worse. Yep. And he knew that in 1776. Nothing's changed with respect to that. So let's go on and explain exactly how the principles of economics lead to prohibition being so bad. So we can take the next slide. Okay, here. This is what you can predict. If you prohibit, by the definition I just gave you, prohibit a transaction people want to get into, people will still conduct that transaction. That creates the black market. And then the black market has some very predictable characteristics. One, there's criminal sanctions on the transaction. That means it is risky for both parties. Two, there are no legal ways to resolve disputes. Three, you've got a barrier to entry. Because Prohibition says, in effect, if you prefer to be a law-abiding citizen or company, you are not allowed in this market. In order to enter this market, Prohibition says, you must be willing to be a criminal. So that's a big barrier to entry. Okay, now before we get to the next slide, can you predict what is going to happen to the price and the profits if there's barriers to entry and high risk?
Will it go higher?
Way up. Next slide. That's what happens. The prices are way up, the profits are way up. Cannabis now costs, I don't know what, $3,000 or $4,000 a pound, typically on the street, something like that. That's the same price as saffron, for heaven's sake. Which, saffron, which is vastly the most expensive spice in the world. Saffron's produced by hand-picking 3 tiny stamens off a little crocus. There's no, it's enormously costly, enormously labor-intensive, only grows in a place in the world. Yet cannabis, which grows relatively well anywhere, is the same price as that. Entirely caused by the black market. And so, of course, because it's a black market, because there's a barrier to entry, the people in the market are earning economic profits. They're earning rents. They're earning a lot of money. Now, what will the suppliers do in a black market if you're earning a ton of money and you have no legal recourse? How are you going to settle your disputes? You're going to settle them the way that Al Capone did on February 14th, whatever year it was. And they're still settling their disputes that way. And they'll do whatever they have to retain that market power because there's so much money in it. That's why 50 people died in Mexico today, and 50 people will die in Mexico tomorrow, and 50 people will die in Mexico the next day, and they're going to keep on doing it until we get rid of this prohibition. Because they're dying there because the gangs are fighting for these black market profits. Next slide, please. The worldwide market for illegal drugs, the UN estimates about 500 billion per year. I promise you that you do not really have an idea of how much money that is. That kind of money is too much for people to be able to visualize or understand. How much money is it? Next slide. I can't show you. I can only show you 255 million in American $100 bills. That's 255 million in Benjamins, American $100 bills. Down in the front there's some colorful stuff. I guess that must be a little bit of euros. But that is what 255 million is. But I said the global drug trade is 500 billion each year. So to get 500 billion, which is 1 year of revenue in global drug trade, I got to take the Empress Hotel. I have to fill every room in the Empress Hotel with that pile of money. And then I need 3 more hotels the same size and do the same thing. Because that's 255 million. To get to 500 billion, you got to multiply it by 2,000. The Empress has less than 500 rooms. So if you take 4 Empress hotels and fill every room like that, that is the money in the illegal drug trade. That's the money they're fighting over. We should not be surprised that there are heads rolling across the barroom floors in Mexico when we are giving that kind of money to criminal organizations. Next slide, please. So what you get, the public perception is that drugs are dangerous and they point to various kinds of crime that's associated with drugs. It isn't the drug that's dangerous, it is the black market for the drug that is dangerous. And there's my favorite example in the middle. Look at that point in the middle. Is that a hard question to answer? Not much. Now think at the bottom. Don't go to the next slide. But another prediction for you. What do you think happens when law enforcement removes some major supplier from the drug market, puts them in jail? Given all we said, what do you predict is going to happen?
People are going to move in and take over.
They're going to move in and take over, except they're going to move in and take over. So how many are going to move in and take over? More than one. When more than one are moving in to take over, what's going to happen? Gang wars. And you can see this in Vancouver. I've seen it once or twice. It happened a couple of years ago. They said, we've just got some big drug pin. And I thought, okay, I'll just wait and watch for about 8 weeks and see the murders come up. And they sure enough did. Whenever law enforcement removes somebody like this, people try to move in. There's more than one trying to move in because there's a lot of money there. And that's when the shooting starts. And our elite members know about this and they've seen it over and over. Next slide, please. What about the customers? Customers in a black market. Now I'm talking about black markets in general, except for a couple points I'm going to talk specifically about drugs. First of all, there's an information asymmetry. The theory of free markets is that if both the buyer and seller are in full information, then the transaction will be a beneficial one in general. But if one side has more information than the other, that creates the possibility that the transaction will actually disadvantage and be bad for the one who's lacking information. In a black market, the customer is at an information disadvantage. Customer doesn't know what's in it. Supplier does. So in the black market, the customer is at information asymmetry and may actually go into a transaction that makes him or her worse off. Second point, the suppliers, because as you notice, there's barriers to entry. And once you get in as a criminal organization, they have some shooting and it can boil down to just a few organizations. That supplier's got monopoly or oligopoly power. Again, disadvantaging the customer. The supplier's perfectly willing to use violence. And the customer has nowhere to go for a legal recourse. You cannot go and complain to the Hells Angels if your crack had diesel fuel in it, which I've heard about. And one last thing, which is specific to the drug market, is that the demand is inelastic. And what that means, very important economic concept, it means that if someone is addicted to a drug, this applies mostly to things like heroin, cocaine, does not apply so much to cannabis. But if somebody's addicted to a drug, their demand for buying that drug is almost not affected by the price. Not like McDonald's hamburgers. If they put the price up $1, you might stop buying them and maybe make your own or buy from Wendy's or something. But if it's cocaine or heroin, the price goes up, you cough because you're addicted. So here again, the customers are at a huge disadvantage economically in the black market, and especially the drug black market. So what will they do? If they're high income, they'll pay the price. If they're low income, there's only one thing they can do. You resort to crime. And again, I just said the customers can't get help. Rebecca mentioned your boyfriend addicted to meth couldn't get help because it's a black market product. And that's true of so many people and so many drugs. Next slide, please. Now we go to law enforcement, and this is where I learned from all the law enforcement members of LEAP. How does a black market affect law enforcement? The first thing is that there isn't anybody to report a crime. This is an important thing, because if I put on a mask and hide my face and hold a knife to Matt's throat and take his wallet, Matt is going to go to the police station and say, some asshole with a mask held a knife to my throat and took my wallet. The crime's going to get reported. But if I buy a few joints from Matt, neither of us is going to go to the police station and report that. No, we wanted to do it. So what does the police have to do? They're supposed to enforce this law, But nobody is going to ever come in and say that crime happened unless somebody observes from a window. Well, the police, they've got to spy, they've got to go undercover, they've got to entrap. They've got to do all kinds of things, which if you think about it, you'd rather not be doing as a police officer. You'd rather be doing things straight up. Because these things, these kind of activities, very quickly get into ethical, ugly zones where you do things you shouldn't be doing. And we've all heard these cases. Well, if you're trying to enforce prohibition, you are forced into that kind of activity that very soon becomes unethical. Next thing. And here's where my business experience comes in. I've worked for big companies for over 30 years, and one thing that I've noticed is that when somebody gets given a measurement with a number that they're supposed to work towards, they work towards it. Anybody else seen that in the companies you work in? When somebody's got a measurement defined, and here's how we measure you, well, people will work towards it. In some police departments, the measurement's number of arrests. And when the measurement is number of arrests, you get that number up way faster by going after drug users and low-level dealers than by going after malum per se crime. So there is a huge incentive to take your resources away. And I mentioned, one of Bill Vandegraff's stories. He says, I'm on the desk, I need a car to go out and deal with a real call, and these two guys have taken themselves out of business. They're sitting there waiting for people to come out of the hotel and bust them for pot. That's a diversion of resources. Those two people were following that incentive. His head blown off. And his friend's head was blown off because he was working undercover on a drug deal, and because the black market is violent and police are in the line of fire for that. Finally, these black market suppliers, they have every reason to want to corrupt the police. They want to corrupt the police to protect their business. They have a lot of money to use for corrupting the police. Next slide. Here we are again. So let's say we are a team of Mexican police officers. We just made the bus and we came into this room. We might notice a few things. We might notice that this is somewhat different than our annual salary.
Yeah, just a little.
We might notice that there are some police officers we know in our own detachment, or maybe in some others, who suddenly bought new SUVs recently. We might easily be able to figure out how it is that they got the money to be able to buy that SUV. We might even notice this pile hasn't been carefully counted yet. The pressure, if you're a law enforcer, and this kind of stuff is flying around, especially if some other people are taking advantage of it, the pressure to let go of your ethics a little bit is very, very intense. It takes a mighty special person to not fall for it. It takes a mighty special person to maintain their ethics in the face of that right in front of you, not counted. And when some of the people you know are taking advantage of it. It takes a special person. Of course, when some law enforcers fall for that temptation, we are all going to crap on them from a very great height. But what created that situation that makes it so easy to fall into that temptation? Prohibition created it, and who is allowing prohibition to continue? Every voter is. So I don't think we can crap on them very much. Next slide. Now here's what some other things are going to happen. I talked about what the suppliers in the black market will do, what the customers will do, what law enforcers will do, just a few other things. If the black market is taken over and there's drive-by shootings all over the place, open-air drug markets, law-abiding businesses and people just clear up. And you're left with the type of inner city you get in Baltimore, other places in the US, where you think you're in a war zone. Total devastation of the society and the economy. Next, Remember I showed you how vulnerable the customers are, especially the low-income ones. Well, other predators besides the suppliers will start taking advantage of that. Those of us who live in Vancouver know this very, very well. If you consider the Pickton case, I don't think there's any doubt that in the absence of drug prohibition, the vast majority of his victims wouldn't have been on the street. They would have been getting treatment, getting their drugs by prescription, as they do in Switzerland. And if there wasn't prohibition, it would have been a hell of a lot easier for those police officers who were trying to catch the guy to get somebody's attention, get somebody's resources, instead of being shut down and told to go away for a couple of minutes. Next one. This is something that's really going on in the US, and there's people trying to bring it into Canada too. When the government spends money in order to maintain prohibition, which it always does, businesses will try to get part of that money, and they don't care whether it does any good. They don't care whether what they're supplying to the government getting paid for has a net benefit to society. As long as the government will pay for it, somebody will try to get that government money. So you have all these people, the private prison operators, the drug testing companies, the drug treatment providers. All of them are basically taking our tax money via the government because they can. Because the government is offering it. Not because it has any economic benefit, because it doesn't. It's a dead weight. It's a dead weight in the economy. But as long as the government's willing to pay that money, people will be willing to take it. Okay, next slide. So finally, and all I've done here, so I've described the principles of economics, how they lead to the predictable consequences of prohibition. Now, the last slide, just how much is it? How much is the cost? Various different estimates here. I just pulled together what I was able to quickly grab off various literature. Since Nixon created the phrase the war on drugs, the total spending in the US is roughly $1 trillion. So that would be 8 Empress hotels, full line. US drug enforcement budget, federal only, is about $20 billion a year. Jeffrey Myron, economist of Harvard, estimated the savings, and this is partly enforcement savings, partly getting tax money from drug legalization, $88 billion a year in the US. Apparently, we were told recently that Obama is doing some desperate cuts of about $80 billion into all sorts of programs. He didn't need to do that. There's the $80 billion he needed. Canada, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I hate myself. I can't spell government. How do you do that? How do you misspell government? Okay. In Canada, 2002 estimate was $2.2 billion. I'm sure it's gone up. Australia, a study in Australia estimated the total cost to Australian taxpayers in general at $6.7 billion. And finally, I myself estimated the cost to Canadian business, just the business part of the tax base, in Canada, roughly $4.3 billion. That's taxes, property crime, and lost demand because people are in jail who shouldn't be. So what we're showing you here is that before I've described the nature of the effects, the kind of consequences prohibition has economically, here I'm showing you the amount of those effects. It is a very big cost. It is a cost that is hitting every single taxpayer and every single business. It has nothing to do with whether you smoke cannabis or not. You are paying all these costs. You are suffering from the crime created by the black market. And I personally believe that if most people who aren't cannabis smokers actually really understood this, if they did the research and realized how big these numbers are, they would be going to their MPs and banging on the desk and saying, why haven't you fixed this yesterday? From an economic point of view, the cost of this is massive. It is not just some kind of interference with somebody's fun. which is how some people think of it. It is a vast cost. And it is not just the person whose so-called fun is being interfered with that suffers it. It's all of us. Any questions? Yes.
Well, I want to, you probably mentioned, but it also affects the quality of the herb because of the black market. And also at my street volunteering, I know people in wheelchairs that try to buy on the street and have their money stolen. And I know of a youth, a close youth, that nearly got killed in a home invasion because of selling herb in his own place.
And sorry, I didn't mention that, but those are two very important things. In a black market, there's no control on quality or content. When I buy beer, I know the percent of alcohol. In the black market, you cannot tell for sure that your cannabis hasn't got something else in it. The other thing is the incredibly negative effect of prohibition on medical use. That's exactly what you said. Because of prohibition, that is why their money gets stolen. That is why somebody goes into the grow-up. It's all driven by prohibition. All the things that make medical use not work well, caused by prohibition.
I'm just wondering what do you think the effects are for the mere presence of the black market alone for people, you know, who may not use cannabis or any other kind of drug like that. Then the mere presence of this violent crime that seems to surround it. Like how do you think that kind of affects the perception of it, or like the
It affects it very much because, and this is one of the main points that LEAP speakers are constantly making, because that violence and this negative stuff in the black market, people have been propagandized by having that called the drug problem. People have been propagandized to think that is all caused by drugs. All of that is not the drug problem. All of that is the prohibition problem. And so what you're absolutely right, the presence of the black market, because people have been taught to associate it with the drug when it should be associated with the prohibition, it's a big problem. And the way to get around it is to do this education and to get people to understand that those things you don't like, those things that are making you feel really awful and angry and yuck about drugs, all those things are not caused by the drugs, they are caused by the prohibition of the drugs. And it's an education effort we have to always get through, because you're right. Until that lesson is learned, people take the wrong attitude.
Yeah, when I do my social volunteering, I'm shocked how so many people includes marijuana with the hard drugs and say it kills like heroin and crack and all that, and they don't know the difference.
They don't know the difference, but even with heroin and crack and so on, even with those, they do not know how much of the death and damage is caused by the prohibition, not the drug. So, yeah.
Really, legalization or anything won't really occur until we look at, like, adding to your presentation of the bankers in all this, why federal governments feel it's okay to put one of us in jail for an ounce, but a banker laundering billions of dollars over decades goes home and sleeps at night. I think that's the quote from Senator Warren down in the States.
That's the quote from Senator Warren, yeah. Yeah, I don't think that, I don't think that's going to stop us. I don't think whether they wake up over bankers is going to stop us. I really don't. Yeah.
Do you care to address the extent to which cannabis is an economic substitute for other drugs, alcohol, and so that even in our suppressing it, we may be making matters worse?
That's another cost of it, and it's one that in these cost estimates here, I don't think has yet been estimated. Another cost of cannabis prohibition is that by prohibiting it, we are sort of discouraging what would be a good substitute for something like alcohol, a less dangerous substitute. One study recently came out, found that in states which legalized medical cannabis, there appears to be a reduction in traffic accidents compared to states that didn't legalize medical cannabis. And you know, the statistics show that this has happened. It's not a huge difference, but it's a statistically meaningful one. The probable reason for that is that some people are using cannabis instead of alcohol.
Yes.
And it doesn't impair their driving as much. So what we have there is a benefit from legalization, people being able to use cannabis instead of more dangerous drugs, that needs to be added to all of these numbers. Does that answer your question?
Precisely.
Yeah.
I would like to add that I try to not drive when I smoke, but if I do smoke and drive, I'm incredibly more careful and more conscientious, and I just watch the road like crazy.
Yeah, this is some research. Other research that's done has said that when people use alcohol or they use cannabis, in both cases, their driving is somewhat impaired, depending on the amount of alcohol, the amount of cannabis. But the big difference was the person who has used alcohol is not aware that he's impaired. The person who used cannabis is aware he's impaired. So that is exactly what you said. Some studies recently have shown that. Yeah.
I had to run away from an OxyContin alcohol-based environment.
Yeah.
And I was set up to be busted because I smoked pot. Long story short. So OxyContin, I was told it's basically hillbilly heroin. I mean, it was crazy in powder with how many people that were whacked out on OxyContin or Odone, whatever you want to call it. And that's legal, that's allowed. And people, you know, and then people are freaked because I'm smoking a joint to help me stay away from alcohol and drugs, cocaine, speed.
Yeah.
And I'm watching all these other people crushing the OxyContin and Demerol, whatever, and snorting it like coke, and that's allowed. I'm really confused. And then the guys that created OxyContin are supposed to be in jail now because they knew that they were creating this heroin derivative. You know, how is that allowed? But you know, then I have to run away because I'm smoking pot to deal with cancer and depression and a myriad of health issues. But if I were to take the OxyContin or the Seroquel or the whatever Prozac, that's okay.
This is one of the reasons why Prohibition is no good.
Yeah.
It's one.
But the guys that created the OxyContin specifically, because even in the States, I mean, they had what they called pain clinics. You could go there and get as much as you wanted. It was unbelievable. So these guys are in jail for creating it, but they're still selling the
Yeah,
OxyContin.
no one's in jail for creating OxyContin.
Nobody's in jail? Okay, somebody told me.
What they're in jail for, and this is a problem, you talked about pain clinics in the US. They, for the most part, pain clinics in the US did not give out tons of stuff to anybody who wanted it. Most pain clinics in the US have been unable to deal effectively with pain because if they give patients the amount of medication they probably could use or need, typically the DEA falls down on them and throws them in jail for trafficking. So there are many who've gotten out of the business totally because it's very hard to treat pain in the US without getting the jump on them.
Yeah.
Now the other aspect of what you talked about is things like OxyContin. There are indications there that the way it is regulated needs to be improved. However, what no one would argue is that prohibition is going to be better than regulation for that or anything. Now in OxyContin, it's pretty clear that there's some problems with how it's regulated because it's not working well. There's some abuse. But if you made it totally illegal, you'd have even more abuse. And making cannabis illegal, you know, we've talked about that, has no justification. Yeah.
Well, I think the analogy would be opium and cannabis rather than oxy and cannabis. But what I wanted to ask you about was following the money further. I mean, this isn't new information. I mean, the people who maintain these laws know the cost of these laws. So
it shouldn't be new information. For the public, sometimes it is.
well, for the public, yes. I'm talking about the people, the people that make the decisions in government, et cetera, right? At the higher levels. What do you think the impediment is to legalization?
There are a whole number of impediments. Just before we get there, I should mention one other thing. OxyContin, oxycodone, heroin, morphine, those are all just opiates. Everything comes from opium, all those things. They're all just different chemical variations. One of the reasons why there's so much abuse of those things is, for instance, you aren't allowed to smoke opium.
Yeah. Here.
You know, if people were able to smoke opium as they could in the 19th century, a lot of people who might now be using oxycodone or oxycontin would probably rather smoke opium. It's less concentrated, safer. One of the funny things about prohibition is that when you impose prohibition, whatever you're prohibiting gets more concentrated, more dangerous. Same thing for instance, crack. I wouldn't try crack. I have people who've tried it and have told me about it, have said this is a very bad idea. I wouldn't chew a coca leaf. I would try that. But why can we not chew coca leaves? Because when you prohibit, everything has to become more concentrated to be easier to hide, easier to transport. But you cannot get the safer, less concentrated versions, so you end up trying crack, OxyContin, heroin, all that kind of stuff. Sorry, what follow the money and what's the obstacle? There's a ton of obstacles. One is, of course, the vested financial interests. In the US, you've got the private prison companies that actually lobby for mandatory minimum sentences. Pharmaceutical companies, even if they don't lobby against cannabis, they are very sure never to participate in anything involving cannabis research. So there's that. There's also, there seems to be, I don't know, I guess government is just like the rest of us. People hate to admit they're wrong. And if you've been enforcing prohibition for 20 years, you hate to admit that you're full of crap. One of the great things I admire about LEAP speakers is that they had the guts to admit that they were wrong for 20 or 30 years of their career, and that takes incredible courage. So there's the money, and there's the hatred of admitting you're wrong. I think in the US there could even be a fear of lawsuits in the US. I don't want to admit prohibition is wrong, and eventually have the whole thing fall down, and eventually have a huge class action suit aimed at me because I was a DEA boss. That would be it. Sorry, Ted, I've been running on too long. Any other?
It's all good.
Any other questions? All right, thanks very much, and here's the.
Thank you very much, Steve. Much appreciated. And your insight is critical to this movement.